Hello, my name is Andrew Schur, and my final computational thinking project is on Broadway shows. The reason I chose Broadway shows is because as a theater major, it is a viable career option for me. I am also interested in the business side of theater, and Broadway is one of the only commercial options for that, so it's an interesting thing to look at the business side and the statistics of grossing and length of show runs and just other things about Broadway that I find interesting and helpful to know for my future. Who does this benefit? This benefits not only actors, but as I said, people on the business side of Broadway, including the producers, the technicians, the people who own the theaters, basically anybody who is related to Broadway in any kind of way. The data set I was using was actually fairly simply constructed. It consisted of Broadway, and in Broadway there is a bunch of elements, and each of those elements was a weekly run of shows. And each one of those elements, it had the attendance rate of that entire week, the capacity of the theater that the theater holds that the show is being shown in, the date for that week, the day that the week started on, the gross of the entire week of runs, the month that week took place in, the amount of previews that show had per week in that week, the amount of performances that show had in a week, the show itself, so aka Wicked, Phantom of the Opera, etc., the theater that the show was shown in, and the year that week took place. The questions I was looking to answer were: 1, what shows ran for the longest amount of time? 2, does the size of the theater affect how long shows run? 3, what shows have had the largest gross? And 4, did the older shows tend to have a higher gross, or do the newer show runs? The limitations that I kept on running into while trying to answer the questions through my data were: 1, it's just an extraordinarily large amount of data. I mean, there is over 41,000 data elements or weeks that the data included, and often it took a lot of time to figure out a way to sort through the data to try to find the answers I was looking for, or just find the data that could answer my questions in general. 2, the data was often organized in ways that made it extremely difficult to manipulate to answer the questions I was wanting, to a point where sometimes I had to reorganize the data myself, coming up with new dictionaries, trying to make it so I could actually run a script that could answer the question. And 3, the data that was actually given in the data set wasn't always enough to fully understand the questions or answer my questions that I was asking, and it required a lot of background research to be done. My first visualization was on the question of what are the longest running shows on Broadway. And I came up with the longest running show on Broadway being Phantom of the Opera at about 1,500 weeks of run, followed by the other 4 longest running shows, which are Lion King, Chicago, Cats, and Rent. The 2 that most surprised me on this list were definitely Cats or Rent, because I would have assumed that Wicked would have had a longer run time than Rent did, or even Cats, because it's more popular nowadays than either of those shows are. The second visualization I was looking at was the effective theater size on show run, or in better terms, whether the size of a theater, the amount of audience that could hold the number of seats it had, would affect how long the shows run, or how many weeks they ran. And in this visualization, you can see kind of a correlation between those two, though it's not very big. It'll show you a little bit clearly in the next slide I'm about to show you, but in this one you can still see that in the larger theaters, they tended to have a lot more outliers, especially once it got to about 1,200 people. to up to about 1,900 people. Those had the most outliers and the most longest running shows, while the smaller theaters tend to have a lot less outliers, and those outliers tended to be a lot smaller or a lot shorter runnings. In this one, it's a bit of a blown up, so we get rid of the outliers that are above 600 show weeks or runtime weeks, and in this you can clearly see a little bit of a correlation right there, and that kind of proves what I was saying, that it does affect how long the shows run, but it's definitely not the only thing that affects it. The other things that could affect how long a show runs is, for one, how popular the show actually is and how well it was directed and produced and acted, and also just how much money the producer had to be able to use to put on the show. And a lot of times the higher the cost of the show tends to get a lot more popularity because it's usually better executed. The next visualization shows the highest grossings of all time. So these are the highest grossing weeks of all time. And as you notice, these are all from the past 4 years, with the majority of them being definitely the past only 3 years. And it had the highest one right about 2013, right about at the beginning of 2013, which had the highest weekly gross of all time, which was at $3.2 million of a gross in 1 week. But what this also shows is the fact that the newer the shows tend to be, the higher grossing weeks they have. And this next slide will show you another side of this. This is the lowest grossing shows of all time, meaning the shows that had the lowest gross, cutting out all the shows that had 0, and putting in a max at about 10,000. Most of these shows were from the beginning of Broadway, towards the beginning of Broadway, which is about 1984 to 2004. Though a lot of them were in 2004, there were still a lot of these shows had grossed in the beginnings of Broadway, and all of these are over 10 years ago, definitely, and sometimes over 20 years ago, showing that the older shows tended to have more of the lowest grosses of all time, which kind of proves the fact that the newer the shows, or the higher the gross they have per week, which, yes, one of those reasons is definitely inflation, but inflation is probably not the only factor in this, but also the fact that Broadway is becoming more and more renowned, for one, so more and more people are going to go see shows. Two, shows are often more nowadays kind of more directed to what the audience is really looking for instead of what people are wanting to produce. So the shows are just more popular in general nowadays. This next visualization shows shows again the highest grossing shows, but in this one it tells you exactly which of those shows have that huge weekly grossing, with those shows being Lion King, Spider-Man, and Wicked, coming with all those highest grossing shows. Those were 32 different weeks of highly grossed shows. And Wicked was the one that had $3.2 million of total grossing in 1 week. But Spider-Man and Lion King are not that much below it, with Spider-Man being about $2.9 million per gross, and Lion King at $2.8 million weekly gross, which is still a huge, enormous amount for 1 week. And this one shows those three shows, but in the total gross they've had of all time, so all their weekly grosses together. And even though the Wicked had the highest weekly gross of all time, Lion King definitely has the largest total gross of all time out of actually any of the Broadway shows, and is coming in about $1.2 billion of gross. But obviously one of the factors is the fact that Lion King has been running for a significantly longer period of time than Wicked has, but if you didn't think about that, Wicked is still for being a more modern, newer show, it has had an extraordinary success and has grossed a significant amount in a significantly shorter period of time than Lion King has, meaning that in a couple of years it might actually surpass Lion King and be the highest gross show of all time. And the middle show that I was looking at was Spider-Man, and if you look at it right now, it seems that it's it didn't do nearly as well as Lion King or Wicked did, which it didn't, in the fact that it didn't run very long. It ran for only about 100 weeks, so not even an entire year. But in that short time that it actually ran, it managed to gross over $20 million, which is still an extraordinary amount of money for how short of a runtime it actually had. In conclusion, the longest running shows on Broadway are definitely Phantom of the Opera, Lion King, Chicago, Cats, and Rent. Also, while the size of the theater doesn't have an extraordinary effect on how long the shows run, there are definitely more long-running shows in the larger theaters, and it kind of shows that there is a little bit of correlation, but is definitely not the only thing that actually affects how long shows run. Also, the 3 shows that had the highest all-time gross in a week were The Lion King, Wicked, and Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, with Wicked having by far the highest grossing week of all time, coming in about $3.2 million in 1 week, with Lion King and Spider-Man being close seconds and thirds. And overall, Wicked has had probably the best grossing shows of all time, as even though it's been running for a significantly less period of time, it is grossed almost the same amount in total as Lion King has, as Lion King was at $1.2 billion as a total gross, and Wicked was only about $1 billion. But the fact that Lion King has been running for approximately 250 extra weeks that Wicked has, Wicked will definitely easily catch up in the next few years. And finally, the newer weekly shows with the highest gross are all in the last 3 years, showing that the newer shows easily have a higher gross than the older shows that ran at the beginning of Broadway, for multiple reasons. Of course, one of them being inflation, one of them being the fact that when Broadway was just starting up, there was not as much of an attendance, and the attendance and ticket sales are a large part of the gross for Broadway shows, but also the fact that Broadway shows nowadays are being much more tailored to what the audience is really looking for, meaning the attendance rate are spiking, and the audience itself is having a more enjoyable time at Broadway shows.